The sun hung low over the Navy training facility, throwing long beams of light across the sprawling range. The air smelled of burnt powder and sun-baked earth, the faint metallic tang of spent brass lingering after hours of shooting. Emily Carter tugged at the brim of the borrowed ball cap shading her face, trying to appear smaller among the men in desert tans and tactical gear. At 24, she looked like any other graduate student on summer break jeans, sneakers, and a weather-worn backpack slung over one shoulder. But she was far from a tourist. Her invitation had come through a family friend who worked logistics on base, a casual offer to come watch the guys train during her visit to Coronado. Emily had agreed out of curiosity, knowing she'd never get another chance to see Navy SEALs in their element. She wasn't military herself, but she wasn't entirely a stranger to the rhythm of the range. Her grandfather, a retired Army sniper with a chest of medals he rarely spoke about, had raised her with a rifle in her hands by the age of 10. Patience, steady breathing, smooth trigger, everything else is noise, he would say as they spent long afternoons on the family farm, shooting paper silhouettes tacked to fence posts. Now, standing at the edge of the Navy's elite training grounds, she felt that old familiarity hum faintly beneath her nerves. The operators acknowledged her presence with polite nods, a few half smiles, but it was clear from the quick dismissals in their eyes that she didn't belong here. To them, she was just a guest, someone's niece or friend of the family, here to watch quietly and stay out of the way. Emily didn't mind, she wasn't there to impress anyone. The drill unfolding in front of her was unlike anything she had ever seen. The challenge was brutal in its simplicity. 10 shots, 1,000 yards, a 2-minute time limit. Every round had to be a perfect hit. The record had stood for a decade, the story passed down among units like a campfire tale. It was the kind of standard that demanded flawless fundamentals under crushing pressure, the sort of test only the best could even attempt. The youngest SEAL on the line, Rodriguez, they called him, settled behind the rifle with a mixture of swagger and tension. His movements were sharp, almost aggressive, as though muscling the weapon into submission. Emily leaned forward slightly, watching the way his chest rose and fell in jerky bursts, the way his trigger finger twitched before each shot. The first round went wide, the second clipped the edge. By the fourth miss, the group of men behind him exchanged glances, some grinning, others wincing. Rodriguez cursed under his breath, adjusting the scope as though the glass were to blame. He muttered about crosswinds, about faulty zeroing, his voice tight with frustration. The misses kept coming. Each one seemed to feed his anger rather than slow him down. Emily recognized the spiral immediately, the same mistake she'd watched rookies make at her grandfather's side on dusty farm fields. Breath too shallow, grip too tight, a trigger jerk that sent the barrel offline by fractions of an inch that became feet at this distance. She told herself to stay quiet. This wasn't her place, and these weren't weekend shooters fumbling with borrowed rifles. These were SEALs, men whose entire identities were built on the kind of precision most people could never dream of achieving. But the words pressed at her throat, unbidden, her grandfather's voice echoing in her ears. Another miss. Rodriguez's jaw clenched. He smacked the rifle's stock as if punishing it for betrayal. The group behind him laughed, though there was an edge to their humor, the kind that cut deeper than encouragement. Emily bit her lip, eyes narrowing as she watched him settle again. She saw it clearly, the way he flinched just before the break, anticipating recoil like a man bracing for a punch. Her whisper slipped out, soft and certain, before she realized it had escaped. He's pulling the shot every time. The words hung in the air longer than they should have, too sharp to be mistaken for mere observation. A ripple of silence passed through the group as heads turned toward her. Rodriguez froze mid-movement, and Chief Ryan Hale, the team leader, slowly lifted his gaze in her direction. Emily felt the heat rise in her cheeks, the sudden weight of 8 pairs of eyes pinning her in place. She hadn't meant to speak out loud, she hadn't meant to say anything at all. But now the SEALs were staring, and the quiet graduate student who was supposed to stay invisible had just critiqued one of the Navy's own. The silence after her slip stretched into something heavy, almost tangible. Emily could hear the faint metallic ping of a cooling barrel downrange, the crunch of gravel as one of the seals shifted his boots, and somewhere far off, the muffled crash of the ocean against the cliffs. Every man on the line was staring at her now. A civilian calling out a Navy SEAL's mistake there were unspoken lines, and she had just crossed one. Rodriguez's face twisted first. He wasn't amused. His pride was already raw from the failed shots, and her observation landed like salt on an open wound. He pushed himself up from the rifle, bristling, his glare sharp enough to cut. But before he could speak, Chief Petty Officer Ryan Hale lifted a hand. The man's presence seemed to command the very air, the kind of quiet authority that needed no volume. His dark eyes found hers, steady, unreadable, and one brow lifted ever so slightly. "You think you can do better?" His tone was even, but the edge was unmistakable. A test, half mocking, half probing. Emily froze. The words were simple, but they dropped into her chest like a stone. She had no business being here. She knew it. They knew it. Yet her grandfather's voice rose unbidden in her mind, deep and certain. Asterisk. Never speak up unless you're willing to prove it. Asterisk. It was a rule he had drilled into her through years of practice. Years of long afternoons spent breathing steady over a scope. Words meant nothing without follow-through. She swallowed, pulse hammering against her throat, and forced her voice to come out steady. "Can I give it a try?" The reaction was immediate. A few SEALs barked out laughter, genuine and loud, their disbelief echoing across the range. One of them clapped another on the shoulder, shaking his head like she'd just told the funniest joke of the day. Another muttered something about tourists with Netflix confidence. Rodriguez's grin came back, cruel this time, as though waiting for her to crumble under the ridicule. But Hale didn't laugh. His eyes stayed on her, measuring, curious. He wasn't dismissing her so easily. After a long pause, he finally spoke, his words slow and deliberate. "All right, here's how it works." He turned the rifle so the barrel pointed safely downrange, checking the chamber out of habit before setting it back into place. "Rodriguez's score stands. You beat it. Lunch is on us. You miss." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dipping lower, his authority unmistakable. "You explain to my commanding officer why a civilian laid hands on a Navy weapon without authorization." The men around him chuckled again, but this time it carried a sharper edge. This wasn't just a dare, it was a wager, a risk with real consequences. Emily felt her stomach tighten, the weight of every gaze pressing against her. Rodriguez smirked, shaking his head as he folded his arms. "This ought to be good. She's gonna choke before she even gets behind the glass." Emily's fingers curled against her sides. She thought of her grandfather's weathered hands steadying hers on the stock of an old hunting rifle, his calm voice reminding her that pride didn't win matches discipline did. She thought of all those quiet afternoons on the farm where missing wasn't an option, not if she wanted to earn his nod of approval. Her heart was pounding, her palms damp, but when she lifted her chin, her voice came out steady. "I accept." The laughter cut short. A few of the men looked at each other, the smirks fading into something else, wariness, maybe even intrigue. Hale's expression shifted just slightly, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "All right then," he said softly, as though he hadn't expected her to agree. "Let's see what you've got." And just like that, the challenge was set. The outsider had stepped onto their stage, and the room that had once dismissed her now waited, breath held, to see whether she would crumble or surprise them all. The rifle looked larger than it should have in Emily's hands, a precision tool built for men who spent their lives carrying weight and steel into hostile places. But as she lowered herself behind it, her movements betrayed none of the hesitation the SEALs were waiting to see. She adjusted her body on the mat with quiet efficiency, tucking her elbows in tight, spreading her legs for stability, and lowering her cheek to the stock until her eye met the scope. No fumbling, no awkward shifting, no searching for how things should feel. Every motion had the rhythm of muscle memory, the cadence of someone who had done this countless times before. The men fell quieter than they had been in hours. It wasn't respect, not yet it was disbelief, the kind that creeps in when assumptions start to wobble. Rodriguez leaned against the bench, smirking, but his eyes tracked her carefully, waiting for the mistake he was certain would come. Emily's voice was calm as she spoke, not to prove herself, but because the habit of explanation had been etched into her by her grandfather. First thing, she murmured, demonstrating without looking up, is body position. Rodriguez was loading too much weight onto his left elbow, which makes the rifle fight against you instead of settling into bone support. She shifted slightly, showing the correction, her body lined up behind the weapon in one clean plane. A couple of SEALs exchanged glances, faint smirks fading. Her left hand adjusted along the stock. Grip matters too. Too tight, and every heartbeat transfers to the barrel. Too loose, and you lose consistency. You want something firm but natural, like holding a bird strong enough it doesn't fly, gentle enough it doesn't break. She said it the same way her grandfather once had, a phrase that had seemed odd when she was 12, but now lived in her like scripture. She settled her finger along the trigger guard, breathing slow. And this trigger squeeze, no slap, no flinch, just steady pressure, straight back. One of the older SEALs muttered under his breath, low enough that only those nearest heard. Textbook. Emily drew a breath, let it out halfway, and found her natural pause. The crosshairs steadied, her finger pressed, and the rifle barked. Dust puffed at 1,000 yards, perfectly on target. Luck, Rodriguez scoffed, though his voice lacked conviction. The second shot cracked, another perfect impact, then a third, a fourth. By the fifth, the laughter that had greeted her challenge was gone, replaced by a silence that felt heavier with each round. The group leaned in, arms folded, postures shifting from amusement to unease. Rodriguez stopped talking altogether, his jaw tight as he stared downrange. Emily didn't notice. She was inside the rhythm now, the old familiar flow of breath and squeeze, cycle and reset. Every detail her grandfather had drilled into her was alive in her hands, in her eyes. Sixth shot. Hit. Seventh shot. Hit. By then, not a word was spoken. Even the teasing smirks had vanished. Hale, arms crossed, leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowed, studying her like a puzzle he hadn't realized needed solving. 8. Hit. Ninth. Hit. Emily paused before the last round, aware of the silence pressing in from all sides. She exhaled, let her heart slow, found the stillness at the edge of her breath. The trigger broke, recoil kicked against her shoulder, and the 10th bullet found its home dead center. The spotting scope confirmed it a perfect 10 for 10. Emily lifted her head from the stock slowly, blinking as though surfacing from deep water. Behind her, no one moved. The silence was heavier than recoil, stretched taut over the group like canvas in a storm. Finally, someone whispered, not daring to break the spell louder, "No one's done that in 10 years." The words drifted over the range, and for the first time since she arrived, Emily Carter felt every pair of eyes not looking past her, but at her. Hale lingered behind the spotting scope longer than necessary, his silence drawing every gaze in his direction. The weight of the moment pressed down on the range like a second atmosphere, thick with disbelief. At last, he lowered the scope, his face unreadable. Then his voice came, low but carrying, firm enough to cut through the stunned quiet. "That's a new range record." The words seemed to echo against the steel benches and earthen berms, settling over the team like a verdict. A record untouched for 10 years, shattered not by one of their own, but by a civilian graduate student who wasn't supposed to belong here. For a moment, no one moved. The SEALs who had chuckled at her boldness now regarded Emily with a different kind of silence, one tinged with awe. Their eyes no longer skimmed over her as a guest to be tolerated, but fixed on her as an equal, someone who had walked into their arena and done what none of them had managed that morning, or, in fact, in the last decade. Rodriguez, his pride already battered, shifted uneasily under the stares of his teammates. His jaw clenched, then loosened, and his voice emerged hoarse, stripped of bravado. That's impossible. He didn't sound angry anymore. He sounded like a man confronting something he couldn't explain. Emily, still kneeling by the rifle, set her hands carefully on her knees, forcing them to still. The adrenaline trembled inside her bones, but outwardly she remained calm, her face composed. When Hale turned to her, his expression softer now, it was with genuine curiosity. "Who taught you?" he asked. Her throat tightened for a moment, then she found her voice. "My grandfather," she said quietly. "He always told me shooting was about patience, not pride." Hale nodded slowly, as if turning the phrase over in his mind, committing it to memory. A murmur rippled through the men, something unspoken passing between them. Respect, reluctant but undeniable. Word spread faster than she could have imagined. The range staff whispered, the team members carried the story, and within the hour the tale had reached ears it was never meant to. A civilian, an outsider, had broken the Navy's sacred precision record. By the time the black sedan rolled up near the range office, Emily knew without being told who it was. The commander stepped out with the measured gait of a man accustomed to both authority and scrutiny. His dress blues caught the afternoon sun as he approached, his eyes scanning the group with sharp precision. When Hale briefed him, his expression remained cool, skeptical even. But when the commander pressed an eye to the spotting scope and examined the tight cluster of holes on the 1,000-yard target, something shifted in his face. Skepticism hardened into recognition. He straightened and regarded Emily with a weight that made her spine stiffen. "You did this?" "Yes, sir," she said, voice steady despite the rapid beat of her heart. There was no disbelief in his gaze now, only calculation. After a pause, he spoke again. "Miss Carter, talent like this doesn't come along often. If you're willing, I'd like to see you work with the team. Not officially, but as a consultant. We're always looking for ways to sharpen our edge." The offer struck her harder than any recoil. Work with them? She was a graduate student, a visitor, someone who had only meant to watch. Yet here was a door swinging open, wide and unexpected, revealing a path she had never dared to imagine. Her hesitation was brief, but in that silence she heard her grandfather's voice again, as clear as if he stood beside her. Asterisk. When you're ready, the world will know. Asterisk. Emily lifted her chin, calm but glowing, her eyes meeting the commander's. "I'd be honored, sir." And in that moment, the young woman who had walked onto the range as a guest left it as something entirely different. A record holder, a teacher, and someone standing at the threshold of a life she had never envisioned until now.